Hi, good afternoon and welcome. We're going to be talking today about Oracle policy automation and specifically the relationship with Siebel through the Siebel connector. The environment I have in front of me has Siebel installed, Siebel Public Sector, and on the left hand side you will see three other folders to represent the three items which I have installed. They are respectively the Oracle Policy Automation, the Oracle Policy Modeling, and the third one is the Siebel connector. Let's talk a little bit about how the Siebel connector enables Siebel Public Sector and Oracle Policy Automation to work together. A number of changes are made to your Siebel repository when you run the Siebel connector for OPA installation. Without going into too much detail, you will find at the end of the process that you have two new screens, and a large number of workflows, as well as a number of new tables which have been added to the schema. This explains why, when you install the connector, you also need to apply the changes in the list of tables to your Siebel database. When installing the Siebel connector for OPA, you need to be on a Windows machine and you need to have access to Siebel tools in order to perform this step. Let's take a look in more detail at some of the other changes that will be made to your Siebel environment. When you install the OPA connector, you will notice a folder called Siebel Objects. In here you will find the seed data which is used to create the workflows and add the tables that I just mentioned. You will also notice some extra files, specifically an XSLT and some CIF files, as well as a new Siebel web template. Each of these items needs to be copied or used during the installation in order to add a new web template or the ability to read output such as decision reports inside the Siebel application. Let's look in more detail at some of the other things that will be necessary in order for Siebel Public Sector and OPA to communicate together. As part of the installation procedure, both inbound and outbound web services will be created. Specifically, for example, Policy Automation Inbound and Policy Automation IO, as well as outbounds of two types as well. The relationship between these two and the significance of the letters IO will become clear shortly. Because the OPA connector uses web services, specifically when inbound calls are made to Siebel, you will also need to ensure that on the environment where you are installing this, that in your server management, in your server configuration, that the component group known as EAI, specifically the EAI Object Manager, is enabled and assigned to whichever Siebel servers you're intending to use this with. We'll come back to the importance of that in just a minute. When we return to the inbound web services and we select the Siebel inbound, you will notice here a number of addresses, each of which points to the EAI Anonymous Object Manager. After install, you may have to change each of these to correspond to the correct server name. Likewise, in the outbound web services, after installation, you may need to change each of these to point to the server and the port number where your Oracle Policy Automation server is installed. Specifically, I'm running it under Apache, for example, so I had to change this from the default port number of 8888 to 8088. So what else has been installed? If we go to Administration Integration and choose Symbolic URL Administration, when we query for symbolic URLs, we will find two. You will see after installation that there are two new symbolic URLs, one entitled Web Determinations and one entitled Employee. These are intended to demonstrate two particular ways of working with OPA. Notice the difference in the URL. I specify once again, however, that you may need to change the port number and the server name. But notice how you have WD minus embedded and Siebel web determinations. The first example is used to display the web determination window, so an HTML window, in its embedded format. The second one will show the same window in a pop-up. As you'll remember, there are two basic ways to let Siebel interact with OPA. Either using a web determination, so a web page, and for this reason we have symbolic URLs, or using the determination server, where we don't have a HTML window which pops up, we simply interrogate the server and retrieve a response. From a business perspective, you could say sometimes you need to interactively walk through the steps with a web window, and sometimes you simply need to send some data to OPA and receive a response with no user interface. This explains why we have symbolic URLs which speak of web determinations, and it also explains why we have web services which contact the Siebel determinations server in order to send and receive information without the web window. What else do we have on board? Provided you have compiled your SRF, applied the schema changes, and moved the SRF file to the necessary Siebel server, you should be able to access the new Administration Policy Automation screen, as well as a Policy Automation Smoke Test screen. The smoke test, as its name suggests, is to enable you to verify whether the connector is working properly. Let's take a look at the smoke test first of all. The smoke test is based upon the employee business object and performs a very simple rule check. It uses a rule base which decides whether the employee that we are looking at is SADMIN, a Siebel administrator, or not. For example, you will see three buttons here: Determination Server Smoke Test, Web Determination Smoke Test, and Determination Server I/O Smoke Test. Let's begin by clicking the Web Determination Smoke Test button. Provided your symbolic URL is set up correctly, a window should appear. The window may need to be redimensioned, but in this window you should see the current record is a valid Siebel admin record, provided of course that you're looking at SADMIN. If you scroll to the next record, who is not Siebel administrator, and repeat the process, you should see the current record is not a valid Siebel admin record. So, two different outcomes from the same rule base based on a simple principle. You will notice that in both times I clicked this button, I received a web HTML window based on the symbolic URL. Clicking the Determination Server Smoke Test, I receive, in this case, a pop-up window. This is not the web determination, this is the determination server. I have sent information to OPA and OPA has responded. The request and response have been handled through web services. So far so good. The Administration Policy Automation screen provides a number of different options which will enable us to investigate further why there are two specific web services, one with the suffix IO and one without. In order to explain this in a little more detail, let's take a look at the mappings view. The mappings view represents a business object mapping to the entities and attributes of your rule base in OPA. For example, the admin smoke test mapping corresponds to the employee business object. It references an outbound port. The outbound port is specifically the outbound port mentioned here. There is only one entity, global, which maps to the business component employee, and there are 3 attributes and 2 outcomes. The 3 attributes are mapped to Siebel fields. The outcomes are inferred by the rule base, so the answer, if you like, which will come from OPA. In previous versions of the OPA Siebel connector, this was the default and only way of creating a mapping between the entities and attributes of OPA and the business objects and business components of Siebel. In this version, 10.3 if I'm not mistaken, this is still available and is still the default way of mapping. It has an advantage. The mappings can be created and modified directly from an administration view. However, there is now another option, which explains why, in respect of the web services, there are now 2 web services, one of which has the suffix IO. As many of you will know, in Siebel tools, there is an object called an integration object. Integration objects are used in many different ways, in many different places, for translating Siebel content into different structures, such as for outbound and inbound EAI, but also, and not limited to, translating Siebel information into XML for the purposes of printmaking BI publisher exports. And with the arrival of this version, Siebel developers can use new or existing integration objects in order to map their data structure to the structure of the Oracle Policy Automation rule base that they're creating. For example, I have created, for demonstration purposes, an integration object called HLS case only, which only has one active component and very few active fields. When I return to Siebel Public Sector and switch to IO mappings, you will see that I have created a mapping name which specifically references the integration object, HLS case only. The key here is that this is an alternative way of creating mappings. It has its advantage in that it's enabling developers to reuse skills they already have in Siebel tools, but it has also a side effect is the mappings are no longer, at that point, managed inside the application, they're managed inside Siebel tools. The net result, however, is the same. They both describe the mapping between business components and business objects, or integration components and integration objects, and Oracle Policy Automation rule base entities and attributes. Let's look at in a little more detail what that means for our OPA environment. If we navigate to where OPA is installed, and we take a look, for example, in one of the configuration folders, you will see a Siebel Data Adapter Properties file. It's important to understand that when designing a rule base and when creating a mapping, the OPA needs to know whether you are using business object mapping or integration object mapping. Specifically, are you creating mappings here or are you creating mappings here using Siebel tools and integration objects? the default is still business object mapping. So if you are creating mapping using the new method, you will need to specifically state that this particular map and this particular rule base is using IO mapping. Once your mappings are created, whether they're created in the old or the new screen, new views, go to the Sessions tab, and you should be able to see each of your mappings, and you should be able to see the mapping type to understand whether. You should then be able to select the mappings and click Launch WD, which once again should open the Web Determinations window. And once again, it should enable you to identify whether the information about the mapping has been correctly interpreted, and you should be able to then proceed through the steps of your rule base. This can be very useful for identifying whether there are issues with regards to your mappings, or whether you have forgotten to identify in the properties file whether you are using business object or integration object mapping. As you can see, the Web Determinations view gives you a full screen version, so is using the embedded web determination engine. If you create sessions of a mapping which is a mapping defined, if you create sessions of a mapping where Save Decision Report is defined, the Save Decision Report view will enable you to identify each of the sessions that have been run and each of the decision reports. You don't have to read this XML like this, provided you have copied across the XSLT file provided by the installer to your Siebel server your Siebel server XSLT folder. You should be able to actually see the decision report live, not live, but see the decision report in your Siebel application. You will notice on the mappings views import and export buttons. These are not just useful to be able to store these as files and move them from one environment to another. They're useful in another way. In this version, in order to assist rule developers, there is now a feature in the Tools menu called Import Data Model, which enables you to pick up the XML file generated and import it into your Oracle policy modeling. You will see a file here which enables you to identify the different attributes and their corresponding original field names to enable rule designers to be sure of having the correct attributes. So each time a new rule base is built and deployed to the OPA server, a corresponding mapping will need to be generated, or will need to be imported, or will need to be otherwise created. And these mappings are important because when you choose to trigger a rule base determination by clicking a button like this, for example, one of the parameters that is copied, one of the parameters which is sent is, for example, detailed information about the mapping. So that, for example, if we wish to send the first name and last name and the user ID of a Siebel employee, how those map to the attributes and entity inside OPA. Looking at these three buttons here, it's important to realize that each of these performs a different task. This button will run a web determination session and will have a pop-up HTML window based on the symbolic URL. This will run a determination server session, so we'll simply respond through web services. This will perform the same, but will use instead an IO mapping. So these two perform fundamentally the same thing. One uses a mapping and one uses an IO mapping. How do they actually work? Well, you will find in your Siebel repository called the smoke test applet. And if we take a look at, for example, the determination server smoke test, we will see that a specialized method is invoked, run policy automation smoke test, and if we choose to visualize the service scripts for this applet, we'll see that much of the handling of this is performed through Siebel eScript. Without going into too much detail, what you can see is that a workflow is triggered and several input properties are populated, including the configuration name. So the configuration name would be admin smoke test, case example 2, or whatever. And various pieces of information are used to populate input properties of the workflow and manage the response of the workflow. There are two variants. The first uses policy automation assess workflow. The second one uses policy automation assess IO. So two different workflows provide similar functionality. Only one uses original mapping and one uses IO mapping. So you can spend a little bit of time going to workflows and, for example, studying how the mapping is performed, getting mapping, loading the integration object, so populating some XML, building a request, sending the request to the outbound web service, and so on. That's it for today. A little bit later on we'll come back and we'll view OPA connector on another subject. For now, have a great afternoon. See you soon.